Hello, tech enthusiasts, and welcome to another riveting episode of What the Tech. Now, today we're actually going to be diving into a topic that's both frustrating and fascinating. Yes, you guessed it. It's the world of managed services. So let's have some fun with this one. Let's go. Hey, I'm pumped to have one of my brothers from another mother, Steve, back on the show for a bit of tech and a lot of funny. Welcome back, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I much prefer 90% comedian, 10% tech guy.
You're always kind of toasting people, so I'm curious, where do you keep all the dead bodies?
Oh, jeez. Troy, nowadays it gets so hard with the zoning and the HOA and, before you know it, one body turns into 10, right? So it is definitely problematic. I mean, I don't know what you're talking about.
Well, look, I'm not calling any authorities, but that's not to say somebody's not going to see this and make a few phone calls based on some missing persons reports that have probably been filed there in your local Austin neighborhood. But
what are you going to do? What can you do?
Looking at you, Steve, I never would guess that you'd be, violent. I mean, it just doesn't.
I know. That's what they say, though, right? It's always the ones you don't suspect. Right?
Well, today we're going to be talking a little bit about managed services, which has nothing to do with what we just started with. But it's always fun to kind of have a quick laugh with you, Steve, because you can take it to places that nobody ever expects. So I can appreciate that. But would you mind kind of kicking things off by explaining and maybe sharing some examples around what managed services is? And, and then we can jump into like some particular routes that, we can access for that, as well as some, cons and pros of it.
Yeah, sure. Managed services, at least I feel like we're predominantly going to talk about, we're going to focus on the IT element of managed services. But managed services in its purest form is anything. Like when you hire a caterer, you're hiring a managed service for food, right? If you hire personal security, it's a managed service, right? So most people don't frame it that way, but that really is what it is you have some type of task, and when it becomes a service, there's a scope built around it. So, it could be you're hiring a caterer for one day versus, hey, I'm going to hire this caterer indefinitely for all corporate events, right? So we're always doing corporate events. They're always our partner. And the managed services for IT it can be similar. You could say, look, I'm going to pay for managed services for a certain period of time for a certain project or product, or I'm going to just indefinitely keep doing it under that umbrella. Most people have the kind of indefinite relationship until we change, right, from a commercial standpoint. The first company I worked for went by the name of NetSolve, which was a startup in Austin. It grew to about 400 people before Cisco eventually acquired it. But we had a managed service that we offered that specifically focused on, at least from the start, its inception was around carrier services, which is, to me, fascinating that I could have worked for a company over 20 years ago that still is relevant today, that type of service. Because in IT, that changes really quickly, right? So it's like, well, how is that still relevant? Well, it's still relevant because even as individuals, if we have a problem with our phone service, right, is that an enjoyable interaction calling AT&T or Verizon? Probably not, right? Like you feel like, oh my gosh, they forced me to these self-help things, that I'm talking to a bot, then the bot gets me to a human, but the human is broken English or whatever. Finally, I get a live person, but then they keep telling me to do things that don't make sense or what. So basically imagine that, but you're a business. And then also imagine it's way more complicated, right? Because a business might even at one location, they might deal with 2 or 3 carriers, right? And the carriers, they're not like Verizon with your cell phone. Turn your cell phone on, turn it back on. It's a lot more involved, right? There's a lot more they might ask you to do. And I think like Home Depot was one of our biggest customers. Home Depot knows those people, like they know lumber. They can definitely show you where the sheetrock is. But the moment they're like, what is the color of the third light on your CSU, DSU? Like their heads just explode, right? They're like, what the, like they don't even attempt it. They're like, they don't even let those people go back there for a reason. They're like, no, like we're not going to do it. So the way it would work for us And again, today, I kid you not, like if my Home Depot in Hutto had a circuit go down, the local people at Home Depot would not deal with it, right? They would have people remote in, try to fix it, and then if not, they would roll a truck. They would not get them to do it. So that's one of the reasons a managed service makes sense when you feel like, look, we've got a ton of employees, but this equipment, we don't want them messing with it for whatever reason, right? Now, some people take a different approach. I mean, I guarantee you, like at a Starbucks, they probably have some guy back there trying to reset the router, right? But again, that shows you the scale too, right? Like the Starbucks is okay with it because there's only 3 or 4 people that work there, and it's like there's not a lot of hierarchy. Versus a Home Depot, very big, and it's part of a big chain. Not that Starbucks isn't, but just again a little different way they do business. But I also would say Starbucks probably has someone monitoring their internet. So if that store loses internet, it's someone's getting notified, right? Now, sometimes you can bundle the people that provide you internet service and provide the managed service are one and the same. Now, that's where it got tricky with us. Home Depot bought a ton of circuits from AT&T to get internet. AT&T doesn't want to, it's funny, they didn't want to have to manage the monitoring aspect. So they basically, under the covers, white labeled NetSolve. So when I answered the phone, and I worked for NetSolve, I mean, this is 20 years ago, I would say, thank you for calling AT&T Network Managed Services. How could I help you? And the reason I knew to answer that is we had a way to distinguish if you were like a Home Depot store or something like that. We'd be like, oh, answer it this way. So we'd say AT&T Managed Services. And they'd say, I'm at store 543. We don't have internet. And then I would log in real quick. And, if you really want to go old school, my dial-up modem would call in to their dial-up modem, and I would connect through a back door. The more modern ones, a lot of that stuff was behind the scenes, and we'd still use. It wasn't a browser back then; it was actually a client to what they call the Visual CSU DSU. But it was software I would run, and then I would look up their store, and then it had a very basic interface that said, "Okay, I can or cannot communicate with the store." Okay, it went down, and a lot of times we were proactive too. A lot of times we would instantly know it went offline. We would notify the customer, like Home Depot corporate. We would notify the local store that, hey, we saw this outage. We're working it. Then we would call AT&T, actual AT&T. And we would say, this store, we got this outage. And then they would open a ticket and they would start running, they would basically try to find where along the path the outage was. If it was in their network, they would work to resolve it. Like, hey, it's part of a large outage. Same thing a power company would do. It's part of a larger outage. We're working it. And then they would update us, and we would update the ticket, and the customer could log in and look at the ticket. But the whole reason for the managed service at NetSolve was Home Depot in their minds, they would rather have someone else work AT&T. Because in let's say a perfect world, AT&T would instantly know that you're down, would work to resolve it, and then if they needed the help, they would reach out to you personally. But really, it doesn't happen. Like, we would basically, we're in charge of just whipping the carrier to escalate the ticket. Like, because what we would do 24 hours a day, if we didn't get an update within an hour, we'd call them. Hey, what's the status of my ticket? And we knew the words. We'd say, escalate to a level 2 manager, escalate to a level 3 manager, page the on-duty manager. Like, we knew how to work their system. And again, the customer didn't want to deal with any of that, right? Like, their whole thing is I don't care if I have to pay more, but I want to make sure that if my internet does go down, that there's a whole dedicated outsourced division of managed service people that were just going to beat AT&T until that circuit came back up. But I don't want it to be me. So that was an example, that we did. And then the other ones I've worked for, I actually worked for AT&T, and we were doing a different managed service, but instead of circuits, we were managing contact center products, which is kind of my wheelhouse. So if someone like Continental was a big customer back then. If Continental Airlines had a bunch of agents that couldn't log in to, do what agents do at Continental, book flights or whatever, they would call. Again, we would try to proactively monitor it, but sometimes it was reactive. They would call in and say, hey, AT&T, you guys need to get on it. My Cisco contact center, the agents can't log in. And then we would start the triage. We would log into Continental's network through a VPN or whatever. We would try to figure out what's happening, maybe reset some servers. If we couldn't fix it, we would open a ticket with Cisco. And Cisco loved that model because Cisco really doesn't want what we call level 1 or level 2 triage. They want someone else to do that, like reset your device. They don't want to deal with that. They want to make sure that, hey, look, you confirmed it's a legitimate issue, now you're opening a ticket with them, because otherwise they'd just be inundating. I mean, they probably got like 10 million users, maybe more. So if you call them every time something didn't work, like, they'd never be able to keep up. So they really want to peel back level 1 and level 2. So that's, if we're talking about pros and cons of managed services, the vendors love it because they don't want those level 1 and level 2 calls. They only want like level 3 and above, right? That's why a lot of times they try to make your IT help desk those first 2 layers. Like, you'll sign contracts with Microsoft and it'll say, you're going to provide these levels of support before we sell you this product. Like, we don't even want to sell it to you unless you're going to do this. And you say, yes, okay, which means, of your 20,000 employees, their first stop is the help desk. My company right now, has a similar thing where you got to log in, and the first thing it tells you from Microsoft, contact your IT support desk, right? Because they don't want it. So that's a big part of it, is how support is factoring into all of this, and then also the types of work. Like, again, like the less technical the business, the more they want to outsource certain IT aspects. Because Home Depot has IT guys that work for them, I have no doubt, but they're more focused on corporate. They don't really want to mess with the branches, right? So to them, and I see a lot of businesses take this approach, our core headquarters, yes, I've got IT guys and they're making sure that thing's running, and I don't outsource a ton of it. But the moment it's a branch, like 30 or less employees, I don't want to deal with it, right? Especially in a franchise model. That's where it makes also perfect sense. Like, because, some guy might own 3 Home Depots and Hutto and Taylor and whatever. But again, like, corporate really doesn't want to deal with him if they can get away with it. They'd rather him call the outsource service that calls and they're just out of the picture. They don't want to deal with that aspect of the business, right? So that's another place you see it a lot, is where, you're in a franchise or you've got these smaller remote locations and they don't really have an IT staff to deal with it. They're just, some guys trying to sell lumber and, sheetrock, right? That's where, again, a big part of managed services would come into play.
So, and I want to get to the why, and maybe different sizes of organizations and what they may or may not use from a managed service standpoint. But like, what are the different things you're typically seeing that are core managed services, and then what are you seeing potentially like coming out now for organizations? Because I can tell you, a lot of the small business stuff, like if they're using Google or something like that, it's all self-service. There's really nobody to contact. There's nobody to talk to. It's very painful for a lot of organizations. But and so they're looking for somebody to kind of, hey, I need you to escalate this to whoever it needs to get to. So I'm curious, what's your perspective on like, what's available out there, and then what do you see kind of popping up in the next few years?
Well, part of it comes down to how much do you want to keep on-prem, how much do you want to move to the cloud. The more you move to the cloud, the dynamic of that managed service changes. Like in your Google example, like, I don't want to do this stuff anymore myself. Google can do it. If it's the docs, the drive, like, they all have fancy names, but what they really mean is storage. I don't want to store anything local. I want to have it stored in the cloud, and I want to do it for cheap. Therefore, Google does it. So then, the moment it's in a cloud, I'm sure you could probably type in, today to Google managed services. But again, there's probably not a lot of firms looking to do that. Why is that? Well, they run into the same problem you do. Like, Google isn't going to give some random external company a lot of visibility or control over their stuff. So that's where it makes it a lot less desirable to have a managed service partner, because, like, in my example previously, I could log into Home Depot's equipment as if I was Home Depot or as if I was AT&T. I had access, and I could do things to help them. The moment those tools are taken away, all I am then is like a glorified secretary, right, who's just harassing people through the phone or web. And then, not to say that doesn't have value, but it definitely doesn't speed your time to resolution, if that makes sense, right? Mm-hmm. And also, again, Google, I feel like they want to make it, one of the reasons they can make it free is because you give up a lot of control. Like, if Google decides to update something on Google Drive, they're not going to ask if this is a good maintenance window for me. They're just going to do it, right? Like, they don't, so you're kind of giving up that control. And again, like, let's say I feel like Google needs more security, like, which is laughable. I would never say this, but let's say I did. You think Google's going to care if I said, hey, Google, 256 is not cutting it for me. You guys got to bump it up to 512, megabit algorithms. Like, no, they're not going to care. So again, this is the handoff is, it all gets down to, I don't want to manage it on premise. I want to move it to the cloud. I am going to give it to a SaaS company, software as a service, right? They, at that point, will let me get a ton of stuff for free, but I give up all control. I don't get to decide when it gets upgraded, how it gets upgraded, how it works under the covers. So that's a big piece of it. And I think, one of the battles I was having when I worked for my last managed service company, Optanics, we were having with Cisco. And it had to do with the fact that we probably had the number one IT managed platform, I'd say still do, I don't work there anymore, but they still do, for Cisco Contact Center. Because we basically wrote a ton of code that would interpret all these data feeds. So it wasn't more your Cisco Contact Center was up, down. It was hundreds of custom API feeds that told us every little small thing that happened there. And we would get it. We would not only maybe open a ticket if that's what you wanted, but we instantly had, code that would kick off to try to help you, to try to fix it. And people loved it, right? Because most of the time, all they knew was broke. And they knew that they had an IT guy who kind of knew Cisco, but again, Cisco has like 50 different products. Like, was he an expert on the CTI feed on PG5A? No, he probably didn't even know what that was for the most part. So he loved it when this thing not only figured out that there was a problem, but then reset the CTI service automatically. He loved it. I mean, he was super happy. Well, guess what? Cisco, like everyone else, is trying to move everyone to the cloud. Cisco has a cloud version of their premise UCCE equipment. It's called Cisco WebEx Contact Center Enterprise. So same stuff in the cloud, hosted by Cisco. I mean, exactly the same. Like, there's nothing different. But now they're going to sell it back to you. So it's not really truly a SaaS, because really they took a premise application, they just dumped it somewhere else. But anyway, they're selling it back to you as a service. Well, we brought up the fact to these customers that were looking to migrate with Cisco to the cloud that as of right now, Cisco has denied all our visibility to this cloud. So therefore, Optanics can't help you. Like, our product, and this is how it worked at Optanics. You could use our tools and manage it yourself. So we wrote the software, we wrote it all, and we would have it on-prem. So you'd have a server on-prem, would get all this stuff, and your IT guy would have this great interface to help him solve these Cisco problems, which really helped if he didn't know much about Cisco. I mean, very helpful. But now, if you move to the cloud and he still wants to use this dashboard, it's dead to him, because they basically shut down all the API access. And what was funny is that Cisco kept trying to act like it was no big deal, or that it was really to help the customer. But really, why were they doing this? Well, they didn't want the visibility, because we could tell when they had outages. And then, if they had an outage, the customer might be able to get credit. The customer might, at a minimum, might be like, hey, look, I've noticed these PGs are constantly bouncing back and forth. Like, there's a problem. And then Cisco would have to do something. But guess what? If you can't see any of that, and half their building's on fire, but it's all a black box, well, then, and they prefer that, right? Because what they would do is they would build a lot of redundancy, but that gave them a lot of wiggle room if stuff would fail, because you'd be none the wiser, right? As long as your agent could log in, as long as someone could make a call, they preferred that, right? But we said, look, it's not just so much about visibility, it's we've built these tools to automatically help them when processes fail. But again, Cisco wasn't interested in that, because they would rather not let you have visibility and screw up these automated tools, right? They love that trade-off, right? And we kind of went round and round. Now, I've heard since then, I'm not with them anymore, that they've kind of met some kind of middle ground. But in reality, I feel like that's something to keep in mind is, so again, back to what Optanics did. Optanics would sell it to you, or they would say, do you want to have a managed service? And what that meant is people that worked for Optanics that were in a NOC would use our own internal tools and would tell you, yes, your call center had this problem, contact center, at this such and such time, and the system automatically opened a ticket. It performed these automated tasks. It solved the problem, or it didn't solve the problem. Okay, didn't solve the problem. Okay, we're going to send it. This is another thing it did really well, is if a contact center has a problem, the IT groups involved, you would think would just be the contact center group, but really that's oversimplifying. If the contact center failed because your EMC data array went down, did you really call the contact center group? No, you called your data group, right? Because that's who managed the data. If it had a database problem, you sent it to the database group, right? That's who managed the database. If it had a problem related to firewalls, which happen all the time, you sent it to the security team. So in reality, a contact center problem could start here and go one of like 12 different IT routes. So we would open the ticket, we would send it to the appropriate team, right? Either internal or external. And that's another thing they loved, is because what takes all the time in triage? It's isolating the problem. So we would do a ton of problem isolation, either through our tool on site to send it to the right person in there, or our team, right, which is made up of all those different groups of people. And then the security guy would just immediately get a message that says, hey, like this change screwed up this thing, and then he would go undo it, right? Real quick, your time to resolution would really improve. That's a value of a managed service, right? Even today, is if you can give them, because the cloud providers are kind of hit or miss about what they give access to. But if you can give them access and control, they can partner with you. So they've not only got really smart people, but they have really awesome tools. And you bundle those two together, they normally can way outshine your local mom and pop IT group that you have, right? Not to say that IT people don't add value. I'm not advocating for getting rid of your IT staff. But I am saying, look, definitely with support, which again, I feel like when I've worked for managed service companies, that's what it came down to. Support is like, how much money are you losing with time down, right? I mean, if you can be down for a week, yeah, don't outsource it. Like, take your time, figure it out, document it. But most businesses I know, especially when it comes to IT services, if it's down, it's money. Money is getting lost. I can't print money. I can't get on the web. Like some of the highest customers we had at NetSolve, guess what, were traders, right? If they couldn't get in and trade, I feel like it was an exaggeration, but they were saying, we're losing millions a minute because I can't trade right now. The stock is plummeting and I can't get my trades in because the internet's down. So for them, it was like downtime was the worst thing ever. So they did everything to make sure that the smartest people were engaged immediately. So you've got to look at your IT stack. How much is premise? How much is cloud? How much does downtime cost me? And then prioritize it, right? Like, where are the priorities, right? Because I feel like, can you save money moving to the cloud? Sure. But when the cloud goes down, how much can you control about bringing it up? Probably very little. Like, that's a big issue if you think about, like, I don't want to say recently, but I remember when AWS had a huge outage. And that's when everybody kind of woke up to how many companies were using it. Because Netflix was down, like all these companies that you don't really know what they're doing, but now you couldn't click on them. And you're like, what's happening? And you're like, oh, well, Amazon's having an outage, and now I can't watch my movies.
Like, I can't watch Stranger Things.
Yeah, they're connected together, right? Like, so again, like, it's one of those things, like, it's great until it's not. And then I guarantee you, like, everybody at Netflix was losing their mind, yelling at Amazon, but in reality, even if you had the smartest IT people in the world at Netflix, they weren't, what good were they to you, right? And also, like, if Netflix had paid $1 million for a managed service, would it have mattered? No. Because at the end of the day, like, the managed service couldn't bring up Amazon any faster. So that's where you've really got to take a look at, like, my advice would be, if downtime is...
Like, because it sounds like you're kind of more of a believer in not moving some of these things to the cloud because of your inability to effectually get things back up and going when things go wrong, and inevitably they will.
Yeah. Well, I would say the perfect harmony, like back when I owned a business, I feel like is actually, doing kind of both. Like, and I'll give you an example. Like, when I did security, I would always have the security push the footage to an FTP server I hosted. So I was the cloud in this example. But I always kept an SD card locally. So if they lost internet and people went on a stealing spree, that camera could keep recording locally. Or my FTP site died, like my server just died locally. And I even did like triple backup, because I had cameras that would run on battery. So no matter which way it failed, I still had footage, right? Now, a lot of times it was redundant, but I feel like that's where I would say the balance comes into play. I'll give you an example. Let's say I'm worried about security audits and compliance because I'm in some type of financial industry. Well, I need to legally keep records, sometimes as long as 10 years. But let's be honest, how often am I accessing a 10-year-old recording, right? Not that often. That's fine. Archive that stuff in the cloud. Like, you don't need that stuff locally, and you could probably do it cheaper and not have to mess with it, right? But I'd say the last 90 days, because that's honestly, if you're going to get sued or whatever, keep that local, right? And you can still do both, copy the cloud and keep a local copy, but keep that local, right? And then you know what's happening with that data. Like, you can back it up 18 ways from Sunday locally, but you have immediate access to it. And that's also where, if you look at, there's still companies today that will manage, like data. Because at the end of the day, a ton of this stuff, when you peel back the layers, it's data. It's the data. What's happening with it? Where is it stored? How do I access it? So there's managed companies around data that will, okay, I'm going to store my data locally, like on-prem, but I'm also going to store it in a data center I own. So it's still not, it's my cloud, but it's internet. Well, that data center, insert managed service, right? Actually, the places where you do the rack and stack, some of the places that host it will do a managed service on top of it. Like, they'll have staff that work at that, NOC, and they won't do advanced, right? Because again, they've got a ton of different types of things there, but they'll tell you, yes, it's down. Okay, I can go reset it, whatever. They'll basically provide you basic triage to your thing, right? That's a form of managed service you can get with the hosting. Like, Rackspace does that. They're a big hoster, and they have all tiers of it, right? And there's a ton of companies that started out similar to Optinix. Like, What's Up Gold is one of them, that they used to just sell the software that would tell you all about your stuff. But then over time, they got smart and said, hey, we can also you could pay us more money and we'll look at our own app, right, is what they're doing, right? So a lot of times I feel like that can be a smart progression for companies, is say, look, I found these tools that are going to help me monitor and manage the stuff I have on-prem. And oh, by the way, some of these tools, if I want to, they'll take over this role for me, right, of the monitoring, right? And that can sometimes be a natural organic progression, right? Is you're like, look, I've got 4 guys and all they do is look at the feeds from What's Up Go all the time. Because, that's all they do. They're just heads down managing this stuff. But I'd rather put them on different projects than just be like alerts. That's another big thing I see why people outsource, is they're getting so much data. They don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to filter it. And it becomes like a full-time job, almost like, like if you ever get too much email where you're like, all I'm doing is looking at the messages, right, to find the ones that I care about. And so they're like, I'd rather just outsource all that. Like, here, you take all the feeds. Like, I still got all this stuff, but you're going to get all the feeds. And if there's an issue, you need a minimum, tell me about it, or even better, start working it, right? Like, that's a clear case of when a managed service, in my mind, makes sense. Is if you're getting feeds from 1,000+ devices, and each device can send you 800 different types of messages, yeah, like, either have a tool or have someone use the tool to figure it out, because that is just overwhelming your IT group, right? Because yeah, should they know about it when it happens? Sure, but they're getting so many alerts. How do they make sense of all of it, right? And definitely, I mean, I think at this point, I mean, there's whole companies built around mining data, logging data, like how they store the data, how they parse the data, and all of it comes down to the fact that as the number of ways you can get alerts went up, people they were just like, I can't handle this, right? So they had to look for smarter tools and then also outsource it to some managed firm.
So what would you say from a data security standpoint? Are there advantages to going to managed services versus not?
From security?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the way I would phrase it is, what data do you have that needs to be secured? Like, because there's levels of data you want to secure, right? Like at a bank, they don't put everything in the vault, right? Like, they put certain things in the vault, the things that are the most valuable, but other than the chairs, they don't move them in there, right? I would treat your data the same way. Like, you got to prioritize it. And another thing I would do is, look, like, again, I'm trying to keep it in simple analogies, but at the bank, if if everyone, like I guarantee you that everyone at the bank doesn't touch the bank's most valuable physical assets, right? Why is that? Well, because they don't need to, right? Like the janitor, he doesn't need to touch the gold bars or whatever you're storing back there that has value, right? There's no need. Same thing with your data. I would say, like, what I love in contact center, because people would be like, well, is your data center, is it Jinx? Is it SOC 3? Is it whatever? I would say, look, here, let me give you some advice. If you never send me sensitive data, then I don't care about storing sensitive data because you never gave it to me. Like one of the best inventions I loved was when the call center, someone's like, I need to make a payment over the phone to you right now. Okay. Oh, sensitive data is about to come my way. And they would like, and it's funny, I had one do it to me today where they were on the phone and they sent it to the app, which I thought was brilliant, right? So the way it works is I'm talking to you, we're having this conversation. Oh, I'm about to give you my credit card info to process something. They hit a button. It transfers to some external service where there's no human. It's just a robot. Please type in your credit card number. Blah, 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 blah. Type in the CVV. Blah, blah, blah. Okay. You're going to pay this amount. Yes. Yes. And then that company is even smarter in the fact that they immediately dump it. They clean it out. They don't store it, right? But they're an external company that all they do is focus on financial transactions via credit card. So that piece of their business is, ninjas, the locks and all that, right? Like PayPal, I love their commercial where they do that, right? But that piece of it, and then guess what? Your business that just did this transaction never got that data, never listened to it. Like you never recorded it like an audio conversation. Your agents definitely couldn't have that's the oldest agent trick in the book. Someone gives me their credit card number. Hold on. Let me write it down. And then as I'm typing into the system, and then I go use it later. Oh yeah, what's your mother's maiden name? Let me just get all of it right now, right? So the businesses got smart and said, look, I don't want this data, right? Because I don't want to be held liable. Like if someone goes back and says, there is rampant fraud on my credit card, and then you're responsible, be like, look, we never got it. We never recorded it. No one that works for us ever even heard it. We sent it to this. That is my advice, is shield yourself. That's way better than coming up with the ninjas and the locks, right? Because that costs money. The more secure you want that data, the more money you're going to pay to secure it. And the more certifications you have to get. And I just say, if you can, spare yourself the headache. And then that's, I would say definitely outsource it. And then those people, let them pay for the managed service to make sure it never gets hacked into, right? That is my advice for sure.
Well, I think there's so many ways you could take managed service, but I'm curious, what do you think are the top applications that all companies should seriously consider, whether it's just, I know your contact center, you've also done some other things, but like IT services, what else do you think would be things to investigate?
Yeah, I mean, security was one we brought up in the last call. I'm a big fan of that just because, again, that thing is an onion that never ends because it has so many layers. And also, it's so unfair to point to this IT guy who maybe he has a security background, but now there's some new vulnerability he's never heard of, and it's going through like Target when they got ripped off, right? Some guy hacked their freaking AC system. That's how they got in. They had an online AC HVAC, and someone hacked that. And yeah, I'm sure Target blew up and probably yelled at their security guy. Who knows? Maybe they didn't. But that dude would be like, look, I never touched this stuff, right? Like I don't know the HVAC, right? Like, again, like, I didn't know it had a backdoor to the network, right? Like, so that's a big part of it is I would say, look, I would tell that, I would have a managed service, but set the clear expectations that, look, if it touches the network, you're responsible for it, like making sure it's secure, right? Like, so that's a big one I would outsource. And I would also prioritize based on if it's down, how much pain is it causing me? And that's where I would feel like, hey, look, keep it local and get it managed, right? If it's a big deal, right? And hell, hire smart people. And I mean, let's think about it. What's the quickest way to get something back up if it's down? Have people physically in front of it that know what the heck they're doing. There's no quicker way. You don't got to call China or wherever the outsourced call center is and hope Google responds to your email. No, like smart people that know the stuff that's right in front of it. If it can't get fixed, it's not going to get fixed, right? There's no better resolution than that, right? Mm-hmm. So that's, again, prioritizing if it's down, how much pain is it causing me? And then that I would bundle around there. And then also just looking at your workload I mean, that's another big part of it. Like, why do most people cater a wedding? Because they don't want to make 5,000 sandwiches, right? Why? Because it would take a hell of a lot of time, right? Not that it's difficult. Sometimes they confuse the two to like, oh man, this is complicated. And it can be, but it's really more about like, where are you spending a ton of your time? And could you, that's where managed service and outsource, I think, would bleed over in my example. But it's normally the same thing. Like, if it's eating up a lot of my time and it's not my core business, like a caterer is not going to outsource the food making because that's their jam, right? Like they have the toothpick, that's their core business. But I guarantee you they don't mind outsourcing other things that aren't their core business, right? Like maybe they definitely might have a managed service around, I don't know, their website, or whatever, right? Like, hey, look, I don't, or the delivery services. I don't want to mess with that. I want to focus on my business. So I would say if it's painful, see if you can outsource it and manage service it, right? If it it's not your core business, does it make sense to manage outsource it? I mean, again, this is where you've got to kind of be smart about it. I definitely would never propose that you manage service everything in your business, but that's how I would prioritize it.
Yeah, good call. I know you mentioned before the call that there was a horror story that you wanted to share on somebody, a corporation actually forcing a managed service provider to do more than they probably were even capable of doing.
Yes, this is a very common...
do tell.
Do tell. Oh, man. This one, I mean, we could have 17 podcasts full of it. I mean, I could give you some real quick low-hanging fruit, but this is very common. And this is, man, if I really hope everyone and their brother listens to this one, is something you never want to do. If you're a small, medium business and you hire such and such to do such and such, and then they tell you, they literally, the words leave their mouth that says, we don't normally do that. Danger. Do not force them to do that. If you give anybody enough money, somehow they magically will do it for you. But that is a horrible idea, right? And like AT&T was one of them. I remember we managed the contact centers, but they're like, we also want you to take over the patching of the Microsoft servers that you basically consist of the contact center. And some executive was like, yeah, no, not a problem. Like, we're in the servers anyway because we have the managed service. Yeah, it's not a big deal. And oh my gosh, it was horrible. And then another one they had that they threw in was the antivirus, right? And oh my God, you would not believe how many problems. Because again, our people, they knew contact center really well, but they didn't know Microsoft patching. So they were literally causing outages by applying patches that then took down the contact center, which would create a ticket for them to work. It was like, oh, that's great. Like, you just created an outage that came into our same center, so the guy across the cube from you is working the outage that you caused with your patching because they don't know what they're doing, right? There's apply, right? Like, it's like anybody else that's like just winging it, right? Like, because at the end of the day, it sounds simple, like, hey, look, you're going to take over managing the operating system. You could call it patchy, but really that's what it was. There's an operating system on this server, and now you're responsible for it. Like, does it have a security vulnerability? You're on the hook for it. Is it misconfigured? You're on the hook for it. Is the antivirus software not up to date? You're on the hook for it. And that is a whole nother set of skills, right? Like, everyone gets out, it's just, servers, but it's not. It's a very much an art of finding what patches to apply, when to apply them, how to apply them on the OS level and the antivirus level, and definitely making sure they didn't screw up anything for what it was actually meant to do. Like, that balance, that triangle, man, very big deal. And normally, like, we weren't responsible for it, and if some guy patched an OS and took down, then we would work with him to undo it. But when we basically became our own poison, and the business loved it because they could be like, well, you're responsible for all of it, right? And oh my God, it just would crack me up how many people didn't even know we did that for this one customer we did it for. And they'd be like, hey, we're having a problem with our antivirus. They'd be like, you called the wrong number. Click, right? Like, 'cause we didn't do that, right? Oh my gosh. I just feel like it was very painful. And just, speaking of Home Depot, I had a hilarious, this is one I personally experienced. We had just brought them on as a customer, and someone called in and said, I'm with Home Depot. Can you look up this ticket for me? And I said, do you know the ticket number? He said, no. I said, not a problem. So I type in, Home Depot search, right? Real basic. not even web-based. This will tell you, this will date it, not through a website. It was a custom, CRM we had, and it wasn't coming back. And I was like, oh, are you sure you're a customer? And they're like, oh, I'm really sure. Like, we just paid $1 million. And I'm like, oh, please hold, right? And I'm like asking people, have you heard of Home Depot? Have you heard of Home Depot? And they're like, oh, they're a customer. I said, I typed in Home Depot, and nothing came back. And apparently at Home Depot, it's really a big deal that they're the Home Depot, like the University of Texas. Oh, and our search was so kludgy, if you didn't put the, it wouldn't find them. So I told this guy like 3 times, like, I can't find you. You're not in here. You're not. And that's the only customer we've ever done that for, too. So we hang up. Oh, my God. Like, he calls the owner of the company, Craig Tisdale, immediately calls him at his house. Then I get a call from Craig Tisdale, and I know he's the CEO of the company because I could see it come through. I'm like, that's not good. So I pick up the phone, and it's like 11 o'clock at night. Like, it's not a convenient time either. And he's like, is this Steve Faust? I'm like, formerly? Like, what? And he's like, we have it in there. Like, he instantly knew what was happening. He goes, we have it in there as the Home Depot because, I don't know, some kind of legal thing they have where you can't call them Home Depot. It has to be the Home Depot. So I'm immediately like, oh, yes, sir. So I type it in. Then all this stuff comes back. And I'm like, okay, I'll call him back. It's like very intense situation there. So, I definitely have some horror stories. Oh, another one working for AT&T. We managed a phone number. I never knew this thing existed. If I'm a pilot and I'm in the air and there's a mechanical problem, right? Like, big deal, right? Like, I'm in the air. It's not on the ground. In the air, and there's a mechanical problem. They have a special number they call into United. And that number went down. And I never even knew this was a thing. And oh my gosh, like, talk about big deal, right? Like, these pilots flying around, can't call in to get, and they basically went to one like a tier 4 mechanic, right? And I remember having to manage that issue. And again, like, a lot of times, managed services, I feel like it works well in a certain swim lane, but the moment it's like, this cannot be down for more than a second, it's like, people better be driving back from lunch, like, you better, like, it's like, and we weren't really set up for it, right? So sometimes it gets dicey. I'm like, in my mind, there's a big difference between, hey, we're down and people can't, like at United, we're down but they can't find their bags or they can't purchase a ticket, versus we're down and people are in the air with a plane that's falling apart, right? So in my mind, you've got to really, the managed services providers almost have to have 2 separate tiers, right? Where it's like emergency, like planes falling out of the sky kind of deal. But we never did. A lot of times, we were just kind of, like, we would work outages as they came in, but most of the time we never prioritized them that way, right? Even like for our system at AT&T, if a United ticket came in, it would say maybe Sev 1, but a lot of times they put that on everything. That was another problem that all managed services have this problem, because let's say I'm an executive at United and, my phone, it's, I don't like the ringtone. Well, I'm going to call AT&T and open a Sev 1, right? As opposed to like, pilot in the air who also called in a Sev 1. Well, guess what? Our SIM system doesn't really know how to prioritize United Sev 1s, right? So that's another issue I always would complain about, is I would say, look, you can't cave in. Even if these executives claim it's a Sev 1, we can't do it because we have no other way to prioritize. And I kid you not, I'd look at a queue and it'd have 100 Sev 1s, and I just laugh. I'd be like, okay, right, so they're all Sev 1. Like, I just worked the first one, right? Like, that's another thing you really got to keep an eye on. And another, I guess if we're adding devices, I would say, your SLAs are a very big deal with managed services, which are service level agreements. So, around, hey, if we're down, like, what does that look like? What is the escalation path, like, even, internally and externally? And do we get credit? So I would say anybody that's looking to sign a managed service agreement, that's a big deal, is pay attention to all of that, right? Understand that, look, if we need help, what does that look like? When does that look like? When can I escalate? That's a big deal too. Like, because they know it. Sometimes they won't share it right up front, but they know if you've been down or have this much of a problem for this long, you can't escalate to another manager. Now, a lot of times they won't tell you that because they don't want everyone escalating. But they have a written policy that says after 2 hours you can escalate to a level 2, and after that like they have a thing. So that's another bit of advice I would give is really understand the policies around the service you're getting. Like don't glaze over that. And that's also where you can negotiate, right? Like when I work with those managed service companies, I would get negotiated all the time. Is they would say, look, I am not good with a 2-hour response. Like if there's a problem, I need a 1 hour. And even though we didn't post it, we would negotiate it, right? We would say, all right, if you want a 1 hour, like that, it's only gonna be Monday through Friday, and we want, I don't know, $500 more a month. And they would say, all right, no problem. Like they would do it. So even if they have, here's our thing, that, trust me, is negotiable, right? Like Home Depot got to the point where we had a dedicated person every shift. That's all they did. They didn't touch any other client. We even had a little sign with the smock that said Home Depot Cube. And if you were working, and I'm not saying it was always the same guy, but if you were working, some butt better be in that Home Depot Cube, because they paid a ton of money to have some guy that's all he did. And they knew the value in that, because that guy got to know everybody at the stores if he had to work with them. Like, not always, but he knew every store. He knew every person at corporate. He knew every person at AT&T that worked that account. So there was this nice, happy family that happened in the Home Depot bubble, we called it. And outside of that, I knew people at AT&T because we called in a lot. And some customers that were down a lot, almost like a lawyer with the guy that's always in jail, right? Like you'd get to know them, but most of the time they would just kind of come in, come out. There's no real rapport. And that definitely helped Home Depot. Like when they had an outage, it was like that team, they knew everything. Like Home Depot was smart enough to even send this guy their maintenance schedules. So he knew, oh, Chicago's down, but they're doing maintenance, so I'm just going to ignore it, right? He'd click it, ignore. But most of the time, we didn't have that cozy of a relationship. So, that's another good bit of advice is, not necessarily pay more money to get dedicated people, but at least get to know them, right? And keep them in the loop, because what you do can affect what they see. And if you're not in sync, the last thing you want is where they think there's a legitimate problem and it's something else, right? So, and it sounds obvious, but companies do it all the time. They take for granted that if they take this down, it's going to affect this other thing, which is then going to alert this managed service company, which is then going to call someone at corporate who has no idea that this is going on, right? And he's going to treat it like a legit problem. He'd be like, oh my God, the managed service called and they said the print servers are all blown up. And then he calls someone who finally finds out, oh yeah, they're doing an update, right? But you wasted all that time. And not to mention, if you have a legitimate outage, those are some of the worst outages I've ever seen, is where you have what I call a layered outage, where you had legitimate maintenance and an actual outage come in, and they, to the person that's observing it through the lens of the managed service provider, they see outages for Home Depot, and then they just blanketly, maintenance. And then the maintenance ends, and then you find out these were actually down, right? Now, how did that happen? Well, that happened because of bad communication. Because you just told us you're doing maintenance. Or you said maintenance in Chicago, but that's a big city where you have hundreds of stores. Like, that's another big thing when you're working with these companies. Lines of communication are very critical. And then anytime you do anything, the more specifics. Because some of the worst outages, the longest ones I've seen, have happened because of that. Because everybody just assumed they were associated and they weren't. And then all of a sudden this store couldn't get internet for like 4 days because a lot of times it gets flagged as maintenance. Nobody's working it. Everybody thinks, oh yeah, it's part of the maintenance. And then he finally finds some guy that's like, that ended a week ago. And you're like, whoa, crap, right? Like this is a legitimate problem here, right? So, yeah.
Well, suffice it to say, obviously managed services isn't going away. I was curious, what do you think, as far as services that will be deployed in this area? Do you think anything around artificial intelligence will start to roll out on how to manage that, especially with the cybersecurity exposure that might exist with it, or anything else?
Yeah. Well, at Optenics, we had a lot of AI, and in fact, that was one of the ways to differentiate yourself in that space was becoming AI, like having it be smart enough to know to draw the correlations. At the end of the day, you can build flows and design actions around those flows, right? Like that happens forget managed service, just in general. If these thresholds are met, like let's say you're monitoring something and it goes above 80, then do these things. Open a ticket, reset this network port, email so-and-so, right? All of these things, bam, immediately happen, right? Now, why do they happen? Well, because some guy went in and said, above 80, do this task. But what you really want, because if you think about it, that's one metric for one server on one application, right? Now, multiply it by 1,000 servers, 1,000 applications, 100 million metrics, right? You think one guy is going to write 100 million different procedures for the, like, no one's doing this, right? Like, that's again where AI, insert AI, and you kind of try to meet it in the middle. You say, all right, high numbers are bad, AI. Okay, it kind of understands high numbers are bad. Okay, and I also want you to notify. Okay, notify, and this is how you notify. But then you let it connect all the dots, right? Like connect all the other pieces, right? Mm-hmm. And then you can, and then it, hopefully you can keep tuning it and making it smarter over time. Okay, AI, if I can't reach things, like they don't respond when I try to talk to them, probably a network problem, right? Or security, network or security. So it knows, okay, this is what to look at or what to do, right? If I can get to it, but things are just high, right? It's probably a server resource issue, right? Send it to this team, right? Like, so then it starts drawing correlations, and then it gets smarter and smarter and smarter, right? Because you've given it patterns to analyze. And then what's really great about it too is it'll aggregate the data and say, hey, look, we've noticed that 80% of the time when we get this alert, it's this problem. So it'll start suggesting paths. And then you're like, yeah, you're right. 80% of the time it's this. Send it there. That's, again, the beauty of AI, is it starts drawing correlations that would have taken you forever to draw that correlation, right? And, in my industry, contact center, they have something called an auto scorer. So in the old days, you'd listen to an agent's recording as a supervisor. You'd say, yes, they did the greeting. Yes, they were polite. Yes, da-da-da-da-da. You'd have this scorecard, right? They still have it today. But they have auto scoring. Well, how does the auto scoring work? Well, basically, instead of you listening to 100,000 recorded calls, it does it. But it knows to look for certain things, right? And it's not just translating words. It picks up on sentiment. It picks up on voice inflection, all this stuff, and it's gotten smarter over time, but it is an AI engine that's analyzing this data and drawing conclusions, but the end result is way better, right? And I think the same thing's true with these, like we talked about, why are you outsourcing it? Well, because I have a ton of data and I have no way to monitor all of it. And yeah, insert AI. I guarantee you, like, if you're a managed service shop and you want to make money, you don't just create an army of hundreds of people scrolling through thousands of logs, like, you could, but it's not really efficient, right? So what do? You buy great tools, but then you also connect them to great AI. And that's the secret sauce right there. When you can, and when we're talking about it here, it sounds simple. Yes, buy the tools, buy the AI, but it's not simple, right? Like, because again, like, it's like anything else, a tool can be used effectively or ineffectively, right? So if the AI starts making bad recommendations, how do you steer it back on course? Or how do you even know that it's making bad recommendations, right? Like, there's a balance there. And I feel like a lot of times that's what separates good managed services from bad managed services. Bad managed services, they've tried too much to rely on the AI and the tools, and they have the dumb as rock people. Like, it happens all the time, right? I'm going to hire the cheapest people. I don't care where they live. I don't care how little English they speak. I'm hiring them, and I got a ton of them. And then I'm going to buy the best tools known to man, and I'm going to throw them in there. And I feel like 85% of my business is the tool, and I only need 15% for these people to turn it on and off when it goes bad, right? That's how they think, but that never works out. It never works out, right? Because the moment it falls slightly outside their, okay, I reset it, it's still not working, you're in big trouble, right? Because you don't have any depth to your team, right? You're relying on the mothership here, the central brain, and when that thing goes south, you're toast, right? So that's a big misnomer, is to think that the tools alone will save you. And a ton of places, they think, okay, I'm just gonna, not necessarily dumb people, but I'm gonna hire one IT guy, but I'm gonna give him the best damn tools, IT tools ever. Because I like that concept, because I don't want to have to manage a lot of IT people, and I'd rather just buy software, or whether it's cloud-based or premise, and then, like, he's the most well-equipped IT guy ever. But that never works out either. Why? Because it's not that simple. Like, every aspect of IT has layers to it, and he cannot understand all the layers, because no one, like, that's the same reason you don't see one guy build a house, right? Because he might know how to do the concrete, but he sure as crud don't know how to run the wires, right? You can't think that way and think, well, I gave him the best wire running tool around. It still doesn't matter. He's not an electrician, right? That's a good analogy, actually, because that's how they think. Like, with us, and like, I don't even build houses, but I know enough to know you can't do that. But the problem is they try to do that with IT. Like, we all know you wouldn't do that with a house. It doesn't matter how great the tools are. He's got the best bandsaw. If you don't know wood cutting, if that's not his jam, like, it's not going to matter. And that's the problem, is they look at the tools and they think that's enough. Like, oh, he knows, he can go like this, and he can, because that's all an electrician does is, this and that. Like, yeah, that's their hand motions, but you have to know what's happening. Like, you have to have the experience to know that, look, you don't run them all to the same place with duct tape, right? Like, you have to understand. And again, that's lost on a lot of them. They don't understand that aspect. They're like, yeah, it's all IT, and I bought the tools. Yeah, so very common problem.
That's the same argument you were making earlier about if they say, well, we don't really do that, to find a subject matter expert, whether it's managed services or really anything, but especially managed services, that is going to be able to triage whatever it is that you're dealing with effectively and get you back on track. Because you said for many of these companies, time is money. And, if they're not up and running, they're not swiping credit cards or whatever it is they need to be doing, they're losing money. Or they're even worse yet, they're spending money and they're having to issue credits to customers because their services are down, right?
Yeah, electrical companies, I mean, that's part of the grid in Texas. Like, they pay huge penalties if they can't, like, especially if an outage, like company A fails, company B, you're on the hook. If company B doesn't immediately take over, every second they're getting billed a ton of money, because they were financially and legally obligated to take over in the event A failed. And like a ton of them, that's why when Texas had that ice storm, a ton of them went out of business because they failed from A to B to C to D. Like, they kept rolling through who's supposed to take over. And most of the time, the companies, let's be honest, like, it normally never got to E. So E didn't care, like, if it wasn't ready or it couldn't take on that much power, because they're like, they never normally get past B. Well, guess what? On that day, they got to freaking Z, right? They went through the whole stack. And all of them were like, oh, my God, like, I'm on the hook every minute I can't provide power. And yeah, like, and then insert ERCOT saying you owe us $10 million. And they're like, can you take a check? Right? Like, they didn't have it. So they just went out of business. But yeah, I mean, it's huge, sometimes the penalties. And, I feel like most companies, honestly, they take it all for granted. Like, they think, oh, we're always going to have power. We're always going to have internet. We're always going to have all these things. And the moment they don't, and then they say, well, IT people, go fix it. And the IT people are like, well, I really don't know that. Like, I mean, that's the reason I remember meeting with the city of Oklahoma. And this guy was so happy to meet with me. And I was like, okay, I've never met you, but sure. And he drugged me into this server room and he said, we have this recording. And then he dialed some stuff. And it was like, thank you for calling the city of Oklahoma. Like, if you need to put down your dog, press 1 or whatever it was, right? And he's like, I don't know where it is. He goes, but this is wrong. I mean, it was bad. It was wrong. It was like, go to building 5 and ask for Susie. And he's like, there's no building 5 anymore. And Susie quit a year ago, but it's still saying this. And I don't know where it is. Like, he's like, I can't find it. And I was like, ooh, that's bad. And he's like, yeah, it's real bad. So I work with him. And you'd think it would just be finding a WAV file, but the way it stores the data isn't that simple. But we found it, and I got rid of it. But honestly, that's another perfect example, right? Like, this guy had maybe one person that worked for the state of Oklahoma that knew how to manage these phone recordings, and when he left, like, no one knew what to do. So they were like, all right, well, hopefully nothing changes, right? Because if you call in, you're going to get this message. And something did change, and then he was just totally screwed, right? Like, he just couldn't figure that part out. And, I feel for these people because they get put in awkward situations because, companies will just lay off, and they're like, oh, yeah, we don't need so-and-so. And then they leave, and then everybody's like, well, I really don't know how to do that. And they're like, well, they'll just figure it out because they're IT. That's how they associate it, right? IT will figure it out, and they don't figure it out. Yeah. And then you call into the city of Oklahoma, and they tell you to go to building 5, and there's no building 5, right?
Oh, man, that's funny. So I mean, another fantastic argument for managed services because, I mean, how many subject matter experts does any one company have unless you're massive, right? To problem solve something like that. Whereas if you do have managed services, they typically have a team assigned to you that have different areas of discipline that can help you, not just triage, but fix the issue and resolve it for, future instances. So another fairly good argument for it. What do you think is maybe a couple cons, downsides to doing a managed service, aside from, some of the cloud stuff and so forth that we were talking about earlier?
Well, it's yeah, same thing with like why you keep something cloud versus prem. You do lose some control over it, right? It's not your own guys using the tool; it's someone else, and you don't. I mean, I remember one of the biggest things we had to go through at some of the managed services that we had to do background checks for different clients, right? Because they wanted to know like who was getting access to their stuff, right? Criminal background checks, all that kind of stuff, right? So sometimes you can require it of them, but it's not cheap, and sometimes they can just say no, right? Like if you're like, I want to run a criminal background check on all your texts, and they're like, nope, right? Like they just say no. Now, you could ask, well, do I care? But again, like you have no control over the staffing. You have no control over what type of training they have. You also have limited control over their escalation policies. That's why I said negotiate that ahead of time. But if they tell you, hey, look, I don't care how angry you are, you're a Sev 3 and all these other people are Sev 1, so I'm going to work them ahead of you. So you're no longer exclusive. Like that's another great thing about having your own IT staff. They can't be like, well, I'm working for Home Depot today. It's like, nope, like you work for me 100% of the time, right? So you can't control how these other businesses are going to affect them, right? Now, again, like you kind of negotiate that stuff ahead of time, but let's be honest, like the way the managed service make money is they have a ton of clients and they spread them across a small team. That's how they can stack it up, right? But again, that's an advantage. So it's like we talked about, like on the AT&T side, we had people that knew Genesis, we had people that knew Cisco, we had people that knew Avaya. We had subject matter experts in those vendors, not just contact center, but they knew that vendor and they knew specific things about them, right? And I think that's where you can't sometimes replace that expertise, right? Is they know that vendor, they know, and they can solve that problem really quick. Versus, I mean, some of these people, I mean, they're just beside themselves because it's an odd thing. It's never come up since they've worked there, and there's no great way to get support, right? Especially if you're sweating your IT assets. Everything's out of support, everything's out of maintenance. You can't call in and get it. And sometimes these vendors do it to themselves. Like their stuff is so reliable, it never breaks. So they're like, why do I need to extend the support contract? Forget that noise. And you can even almost think about support like extending managed service, because really what you're saying to that vendor is, yes, I want to be able to pick up the phone and call you if there's a problem. So I'm going to keep paying maintenance renewals. But the moment you stop that and you don't really have a plan B, yeah, you're rolling the dice. And you know what? If you get away with it, great. You look like a hero. But the moment a problem happens, right? I mean, it's, same thing you could say with security. I have no security on everything. Every password I have is password 1234. Like, nobody ever breaks in? Well, no problem, right? No harm, no foul, right? But the moment they do, you're in trouble, right? So,
well, Steve, I want to thank you for coming on here and educating us on not only managed services, but some of the key aspects of it, as well as your always entertaining stories. And for those of you who really enjoyed the show, I hope that you'll hit that subscribe button, boop the like button from my man Steve, and we'll see you on future episodes. And make sure you stay healthy, stay safe, and not just on the internet, because Steve knows he gets in trouble on the internet. So, as a matter of fact, probably he'll get in trouble for this episode. Who knows?
Yay! Internet jail, here I come.
All right, we'll see you next week. Take care.
See you next week.